The Baxter family built this empire with blood and sweat, not by keeping a worthless desk jockey on the payroll, Marcus hissed. The sharp prongs of his silver fork scraped directly over the brass nameplate pinned to my heavy work jacket, the metal-on-metal screech echoing like a slur. Do us all a favor and take it off before you embarrass the family name. But the real cruelty didn't come from the loudmouth golden boy. It came from the head of the table. My biological father, the man who had ruthlessly erased every trace of my poor working-class mother, just smirked and looked away. Next to him, my stepmother Eleanor covered her mouth to hide a venomous giggle. Listen to your brother Luke. You were born to type in a corner where it's safe. My heart turned to ice. A sick feeling twisted in my gut. They looked at me, a quiet, skinny girl shoved into the freezing server rooms, as the perfect punching bag to flex their ego. To them, I was just a ghost in a blue-collar uniform. He jutted his chin out, desperate to see me lower my head in submission. But his meathead brain would never understand. The person sitting silently across from him wasn't a parasite. I was the invisible executioner who could choke the life out of their entire corporate network with a single cold keystroke. They were dead certain I would always be the dirt under their shoes. Right up until the night of the Founders' Gala. Arthur Baxter, the ruthless patriarch who started it all, stepped up to the podium holding the Legacy Award. Down below, Marcus reached out his hands, eagerly waiting for his crown. Time compressed. In the dark corner of the room, the corner of my mouth slowly curled into a dead, chilling smile. Because in the very next second, the old man walked right past his precious grandson. He pointed his heavy brass cane straight at my chest, his gravelly voice tearing open the humiliating secret buried for the last 90 days. Put your hands down, Marcus. If it wasn't for this girl rewriting 3 lines of code a half-second before the crash, your entire legacy project would be rotting in the gutter. A horrifying silence instantly swallowed the banquet hall. But this mask-ripping moment didn't just happen. To strip them of their pride so flawlessly, I had to start exactly 90 days ago. On the freezing morning, this family threw me to the bottom of the abyss, fully believing the dark would bury me forever. Monday morning. A brutal Virginia wind battered the thin glass of the corporate headquarters. It was the kind of cold that sank right into your bones. I stood outside Vance's office holding a battered cardboard box. Vance was the head of network security, but in reality, he was just a highly paid puppet. He wouldn't even look me in the eye. He just shuffled some papers on his mahogany desk and jerked his chin toward the dark, narrow hallway. The one leading down to basement C. An unspoken directive from Richard Baxter, my biological father. Last month, I worked 3 back-to-back hazard shifts down in the old cooling tunnels. I sent 70% of that hazard pay straight to his accounts to clear the remaining debt from my late mother's hospital bills. Richard took the cash, swallowed it whole, and rewarded me by banishing me to the unheated sub-basement, the corporate junkyard. Out of sight, out of mind. A calculated move to clear the main stage for his golden boy Marcus. I gave Vance a single curt nod. I turned on my heel. My heavy steel-toed boots hit the freezing concrete floor. Thud, 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 steady, measured. Not a single word of complaint left my lips. Crying was just red meat for the Baxter family. I refused to feed them. Basement C was a sensory nightmare. The air stank of burnt copper wiring and 3-day-old stale coffee. The giant cooling fans roared, vibrating the cheap tin walls until my teeth rattled in my skull. 2 low-level IT techs were slouched in the corner, snoring with their muddy boots propped up on a desk. They didn't even flinch when the heavy metal door clicked shut behind me. I walked to a cramped, empty desk shoved against the far wall. I dropped my box. I didn't sigh. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a cheap cotton handkerchief. I wiped down the cold metal surface, dragging the rag through a thick layer of black grime. Then I unpacked. I set up the heavy monitor, the mechanical keyboard, the spiral notepad. I aligned the edge of the keyboard exactly parallel to the edge of the desk. Perfect 90-degree angles. A mechanical extreme precision. The physical discipline of a blue-collar worker building a brick wall in her mind. This was my armor. The absolute suppression of chaos. They wanted this isolation to break me. It was only making me harder. Above my desk, a pane of dirty, yellowed glass offered a view of the main floor overhead, the elite territory. I stared through the smudges. Julian Thorne and the senior management team were grouped around the digital projection table, the golden boys of the company. Their custom suits were wrinkled, collars unbuttoned, ties loosened. They were laughing, leaning heavily on the expensive glass screens, treating a multi-million-dollar data infrastructure like a cheap sports bar counter. My gray eyes narrowed. I watched Julian casually draw up the Q3 access protocols with lazy, arrogant strokes. Sloppy, careless. I indexed every single face, every skipped security check, every lazy habit. I didn't need a weapon to dismantle them. My brain was quietly cataloging the fatal flaws of these so-called elites. They were completely blind to the rot in their own system. I reached down and shoved the thick Ethernet cable into the back of my tower. Ting! The sharp chime of the notification bell pierced the hum of the cooling fans. A small gray box popped up on the bottom right corner of my monitor. An email. Sender Eleanor Baxter. Subject Family Anniversary Gala. The preview text was pure poison dripping with upper-class disgust. Luke, make sure you use the garage entrance tonight. Don't let your father's guests smell motor oil on you. My jaw locked. The muscles in my neck pulled tight. I stared at the dark monitor. It reflected my hollow cheeks and the heavy, exhausted bags under my eyes. A ghost in a work shirt. My hand didn't shake. I moved the mouse. Click. Except, the real war wasn't on the projection boards upstairs. It was waiting for me at the dinner table tonight. The screech of Marcus's silver fork scraping against my nameplate still rang in my eardrums. Laughter echoed around the dining room, soaking into the heavy Persian rugs. I sat perfectly still. My teeth clamped down on the inside of my cheek. Harder. The sharp metallic taste of copper flooded my tongue. I swallowed the blood. I didn't throw my glass of cheap red wine in his face. I didn't scream or shatter a porcelain plate. Instead, I carefully picked up my white linen napkin. I folded it in half, then in quarters. A perfect, crisp square placed exactly on the edge of the polished mahogany table. Across from me, Marcus was using silver, salt, and pepper shakers to map out his new software rollout. The Golden Boy's big fourth quarter presentation for the board of directors. He aggressively slid the pepper shaker forward, bragging about a total market takeover. He completely ignored the glaring compliance blind spot on the south end of his little table diagram. A fatal system flaw. A digital death trap that would cost the family company millions in fines. Let him talk. Let him dig his own grave. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs slid soundlessly across the expensive rug. Excuse me, Richard. I have a system check shift in the basement. My voice was flat, empty of any human emotion. My biological father didn't even look up from his rare steak. He just flicked his wrist, shooing me away like a stray dog begging for scraps at the back door. Marcus took a long, arrogant sip of his bourbon, his lips curling into a greasy smirk. They sat there wrapped in $1,000 custom suits, suffocating the room with the smell of heavy cigars and Eleanor's sickeningly sweet floral perfume. They thought my silence was submission, the pathetic surrender of a weak girl. They didn't understand the mind of a data analyst. You don't make a sound when you're quietly gathering the exact evidence needed to dismantle their fraud. I turned and walked out the heavy oak doors. The Virginia night hit me like a physical punch. Freezing winter wind whipped down from the hills, stinging my face. The driveway was flooded with motion sensor security lights. Right in the center, parked like a shiny trophy, was Marcus's brand new Ford F-150 Limited. Custom trim, gleaming black paint, a six-figure gift from Daddy just for showing up to his corner office. I kept my head down, shoulders tense, and walked to the darkest corner of the lot. My car was a rusted 10-year-old sedan. The paint was peeling off the hood like dead skin. I jammed my key into the stiff lock. The door whined loudly on dry hinges. I dropped into the driver's seat and slammed it shut. The tiny cabin smelled like rotting plastic, damp upholstery, and stale air. I turned the ignition. The engine choked, sputtered, and finally roared to life with a pathetic vibrating rattle. I cranked the broken heater dial all the way to the right. Nothing but a blast of ice-cold air hit my face. My hands gripped the cracked steering wheel. I reached over, grabbing a piece of folded cardboard from the passenger seat and jammed it hard into the gap in the driver's side window to block the biting wind. My knuckles went white. The cold was sinking into my blood, freezing every nerve. The isolation was absolute. Just a blue-collar ghost sitting in a freezing metal box watching her own flesh and blood laugh inside a warm, glowing mansion. Then the storm broke. Heavy drops of freezing rain began to slam against the thin, rusted roof of my car. Tap, 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 tap. My breath caught in my throat. My chest tightened. I froze, listening to the rhythm beating against the cheap steel. The drops weren't random, not to a brain wired for data patterns. The rain hammered out a sequence of short and long bursts. Morse code. A violent rush of memory ripped through the freezing car. The image of a leaking attic apartment in a bad zip code. The sound of my mother's frail, calloused hand tapping a cheap wooden pencil against a peeling table. She was dying of an illness Richard refused to pay for, but her eyes were sharp. The freezing Virginia rain pounded harder on the metal roof, but the cold inside me vanished. It was replaced by a vicious burning fire. The rhythmic tapping on the rusted roof pulled my mind backward. 15 years back, straight to a cramped illegal attic apartment on the wrong side of the tracks. Rain leaked through the cheap ceiling tiles, dripping into a plastic bucket near the radiator. The room always smelled like cheap rubbing alcohol, damp mold, and sickness. My mother, Sarah, sat curled on a thrift store mattress, wrapped in a thin blanket. A violent, rattling cough shook her hollow chest. The Baxter family had sucked the absolute best years of her youth, dry used her until she was sick, and then threw her out like trash. They didn't leave her a single dime for health care. While Richard and Eleanor hosted $50,000 charity galas, my mother coughed up blood into a paper towel. But she didn't cry. She never cried. She pulled me close to her side. Her bony fingers rested on the dials of a beat-up second-hand ham radio. She slowly turned the knob. The speakers spat out heavy static, catching broken fragments of police scanners and long-haul trucker chatter. Just a wall of noisy, meaningless garbage. "Listen to me, Luke." Her voice was thin, but her eyes were sharp as broken glass. "They have the money, they have the power, but they are loud and they are stupid. Don't listen to their clapping, listen to your own breathing." Her calloused hand gripped a blunt yellow pencil. She started tapping it against the rotting wood of the nightstand. Dot. Dot. Dash. She taught me how to find the pattern inside the chaos. She didn't have a trust fund to leave me. Instead, she taught me how to analyze the tremor in a man's voice over a static-filled frequency. She taught me that liars always have a rhythm. That poor dying woman sitting in a freezing attic forged the data processing brain I use today. A massive air horn ripped through the night. An 18-wheeler blasted past me on the dark highway, throwing a sheet of dirty water across my windshield. I jerked back to reality. The Virginia rain was still pouring. The heater in the rusted sedan was still blowing dead cold air. I looked down at my hands gripping the cheap plastic steering wheel. My fingernails weren't manicured or painted glossy red like Eleanor's. My palms were rough. The skin was thick and calloused from working brutal graveyard shifts, chucking boxes at a fulfillment center just to pay my own college tuition. I ran my thumb over a thick scar near my wrist. This scar, this rough skin, this bloodline, it wasn't a stain to be hidden. It was heavy armor. The Baxters despised this working-class blood. They treated me like a stray dog because I reminded them that their pristine family tree grew out of the dirt. I didn't need their validation anymore. I was going to use this exact bloodline to crush their arrogance into powder. My foot lifted off the brake. I grabbed the stiff gear shift. I didn't turn left toward my miserable, cramped apartment to sleep off the humiliation. I yanked the wheel hard to the right. My boot stomped down on the gas pedal. The rusted sedan roared, tearing through the rain, heading straight back to the corporate data center. The green digital clock on the dashboard flashed. 3:00 a.m. I didn't need pity. I didn't need a shoulder to cry on. The only thing I needed right now was raw data and the absolute darkness of the sub-basement server room. The real war wasn't going to happen in a fancy dining room covered in Persian rugs. It was waiting in the millions of lines of code I was about to rip wide open. 4 a.m. The basement server room was as cold as a morgue. 3 oversized monitors threw a harsh pale blue light across my face. My eyes burned thick with red veins. My fingers hammered the mechanical keyboard, pushing through thousands of lines of risk analysis code for the Q4 global rollout tomorrow. On the far right screen, I kept a hidden tab open, Julian Thorne's social media feed. They were at a high-end downtown club. Marcus had his expensive leather shoes propped up on a VIP table, laughing while a waitress poured a $1,000 bottle of champagne over the sticky floor just for the cameras. They were sleeping easy tonight, trusting their safety to the exact same worthless desk jockey they had humiliated at dinner. The invisible labor of the blue-collar ghost keeping the ivory tower standing. The heavy steel door at the back of the room let out a low, grinding squeal. My spine went rigid. I shifted my weight, my right hand flying across the keyboard to instantly hide the restricted network panels. Elena Vance walked in, the graveyard shift IT technician. She wore a faded oversized wool sweater with frayed cuffs. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy knot after 12 hours of resetting routers and crawling under desks. She didn't offer any loud, fake upper-class greetings. She didn't hit me with the hollow pity that rich people love to dump on the working class. Elena just walked up to my desk and set down a cheap cardboard cup of steaming black diner coffee. Next to it, half of a cold deli turkey sandwich wrapped in wax paper. She didn't speak. She just tapped her index and middle fingers twice against the cold stainless steel edge of my desk. A quiet rhythm. The silent language of the people stuck at the absolute bottom of the food chain. That raw, unpolished kindness made my chest tighten. It hit harder than any slap. Strangers in frayed sweaters showing more humanity in the dark than my own bloodline ever had in the light. I gave her a single nod. Elena turned and walked back to her station. I reached for the sandwich. The bread was dry. The turkey was cheap and salty. But my empty stomach was contracting with sharp twisting cramps, and I needed the fuel. I chewed the dry food, washing it down with a swig of the bitter, scalding coffee. My body was exhausted, but my brain was terrifyingly awake. I dragged my mouse back to the center screen. I initiated the final data filter for the new financial software Marcus was supposed to launch tomorrow. Columns of code cascaded down the screen like a waterfall. It all looked perfectly clean. The expensive outside consultants had signed off on it. Richard had signed off on it. But the survival instinct hammered into my head by a dying woman in a leaking attic started knocking against my skull. There was a stutter. A tiny microscopic hesitation in the data stream. Like a long dash in a sea of short dots. I leaned closer to the monitor. The blue light reflected in my dilated pupils. I highlighted the anomaly and ripped the encryption apart. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a coding error. It was a sleeper virus, a heavy-grade ransomware package buried deep inside the core framework. It was programmed to trigger the exact second Marcus inserted his master USB drive during the live presentation tomorrow. It would lock the company's entire global asset pool, erase the backups, and hold the Baxter family empire hostage. Complete, catastrophic corporate suicide. And it was aimed right at the South End compliance blind spot Marcus had smugly ignored at the dinner table. My fingers hovered perfectly still over the keys. All I had to do was nothing. All I had to do was close the window, drink my cheap coffee, and let tomorrow morning happen. If I turned a blind eye right now, my father and my arrogant brother would lose absolutely everything before lunch. 2:00 p.m. The Q4 live launch. I watched the security feed from my basement corner. Upstairs in the glass boardroom, Marcus stood at the head of the mahogany table, adjusting his expensive silk tie. Richard beamed with pride, holding a crystal glass of ice water. Marcus held up the master USB drive, flashing his greasy, arrogant smile for the investors on the video call. Time to make history, Marcus boasted. He plugged it into the console. Instantly, all 3 of my monitors violently flashed. Red error blocks chewed through the screen. A high-pitched screeching alarm ripped through the building's PA system. The data lockout had started. The ransomware was eating the family empire alive, freezing every bank account and wiping the backup servers. Hundreds of millions of dollars vanishing into thin air in real time. Upstairs, absolute panic. Julian Thorne was shouting into his cell phone, his face pale and sweating through his designer collar. Richard slammed his fist down on the glass table, his face turning an ugly, blotchy purple. They were trapped, blind and bleeding cash. Down in the freezing basement, I didn't flinch. I reached out and slowly pushed my empty cardboard coffee cup to the edge of the desk. My gray eyes locked onto the chaotic strings of red code. The expensive IT consultants Richard hired were running around upstairs like headless chickens, relying on million-dollar firewalls that were already dead. But a virus is just a locked door. You just need the right crowbar. I ignored the modern network entirely. I reached into my bottom drawer and pulled out a dusty 10-year-old analog modem cable. The kind of junk they threw away a decade ago. I plugged it directly into the hard line in the wall, bypassing their dead network. My calloused fingers hit the mechanical keys. Hard. Fast. I wasn't doing this to save my brother. If Marcus lost the company today, Richard would spend the rest of his life mourning the Golden Boy's bad luck. But if I let it burn, I was just a victim in the ashes. I didn't want their gratitude. I wanted the absolute cold certainty that I held their entire world in my cheap, scarred hands. I typed a 3-line kill switch. A forced override. I hit enter. The screeching alarm abruptly choked and died. The red blocks on the screen dissolved, replaced by a calm, steady green. The system rebooted. Safe. 10 seconds later, the intercom on my desk crackled to life. "We're good." Marcus's voice boomed through the speaker, breathless but bragging. I caught it. I yanked the drive and manually forced a hard reset. And my gut just told me something was off. Upstairs, the boardroom erupted in applause. Richard was probably slapping him on the back. I sat alone in the dark, listening to a mediocre man steal my labor. If you're listening to this, I know you've been exactly where I am. You've done the invisible heavy lifting. You've cleaned up the mess your toxic family left behind, only to watch the golden child take all the credit while you stay in the shadows. If you know that quiet burning rage, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what was the biggest mess you had to clean up for a family member who never even said thank you. Let me know I'm not the only one. I didn't yell at the speaker. I didn't run upstairs to demand my rightful praise. Begging for scraps of validation from Richard was a beggar's game. I looked at the glowing white text on my center screen. The server access log. It clearly showed my terminal, my ID, and my exact keystrokes shutting down the virus 3 seconds before Marcus even touched his keyboard. Hard, undeniable proof. My face was a mask of cold stone. I rested my finger on the keyboard. I pressed delete. The log vanished. The screen went completely black. I didn't need their fake applause. I was building a guillotine, and today was just the first piece of wood. 2 months passed since the Q4 launch disaster. The countdown clock in my head ticked closer to the 90-day mark. Today, the final candidate list for the Global Executive Program, the fast track to the Chief Technology Officer chair, arrived at the main corporate lobby. Eleanor stood near the front glass doors, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, linking her arm tightly through Marcus's. Richard stood a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back, his chin tilted up. He was already tasting the victory. The entire Baxter family assumed that golden ticket was printed with Marcus's name. Arthur Baxter, the ruthless chairman of the board, walked through the double doors. Not a single person in my family looked toward the back corner, where I stood pressed against the cheap break room coffee machine holding a paper cup. To them, I was just a shadow. A blue-collar ghost allowed to stand in the corner and watch the future king take his crown. Arthur tore open the heavy parchment envelope. The paper ripped loudly in the quiet room. The marble lobby was dead silent. You could hear the faint hum of the ceiling vents. Arthur's old sharp eyes scanned the page. Top overall score. The chairman's voice cut through the air, dry and absolute. Perfect marks in both system architecture and security encryption. A flawless data profile. Richard smiled wide. He nudged Marcus with his elbow, preparing him to step forward and shake the old man's hand. But Arthur lowered the paper. He didn't look at Marcus. He read the single bolded name at the top of the list. Luke Baxter. Richard's smile froze. The muscles in his jaw locked tight. Eleanor's hand slipped. Her expensive ceramic coffee cup dropped shattering into pieces against the marble floor. Dark liquid splattered across her polished leather boots. The air rushed out of the room. Marcus stood perfectly still, his mouth hanging open like a broken statue. The arrogant smirk was wiped entirely off his face. Richard's skin turned a dark, flushed red. He didn't look proud. He didn't look happy. My biological father took 3 long, aggressive strides toward me. He slammed his heavy fist down on a plastic folding table. He didn't care about the dozens of junior employees staring at him. "This is impossible," Richard roared, pointing a thick finger an inch from my face. "What kind of dirty trick did you pull? You manipulated the back-end servers, didn't you, Arthur? She rigged the system." The ultimate betrayal, naked raw abuse. Instead of showing an ounce of pride, the man who gave me half his DNA chose to publicly brand his own daughter a thief. He would rather destroy my entire career and frame me for corporate fraud than admit his golden boy was a lazy, incompetent fraud. I didn't step back. Not a single inch. My hand tightened around my cheap paper cup. I squeezed it until the cardboard crumpled and collapsed inward. I tossed it straight into the trash can. I reached down and smoothed out a small wrinkle on the sleeve of my heavy work jacket. A precise mechanical movement. I looked up. My cold gray eyes locked onto Richard's twitching pupils. "I didn't apply using the Baxter name," I said. My voice was low, sharp, colder than the Virginia wind outside. "I submitted under an independent employee ID." Richard stopped breathing. The truth was a physical weight crushing his chest. "They didn't choose me because of the last name you handed out," I said, leaning in just a fraction of an inch. "They chose me because of my brain." I didn't wait for him to respond. I ignored Eleanor's heavy, panicked breathing. I turned on my heel and walked away. My steel-toed boots knocked a steady, heavy rhythm against the marble floor. I headed straight for the elevator that would take me to the final boardroom audit. The first bomb had just dropped. The afternoon before the final board audit, I was walking down the dimly lit concrete hallway leading to the basement storage archives. The air down here smelled like damp cardboard and dead silverfish. Footsteps echoed ahead. The sharp, expensive click-clack of stiletto heels hitting the concrete. Richard and Eleanor stepped out from the shadows, blocking the narrow corridor. Down at the far end, near the exit door, Julian Thorne stood leaning against the wall, acting as the lookout. They were treating this like a back-alley shakedown. They didn't carry the loud screaming rage from the lobby. This was different. This was cold, calculated corporate manipulation. Eleanor stepped forward. Her heavy musk perfume aggressively pushed away the stale basement air, suffocating the space around me. She opened her designer leather bag. Her perfectly manicured fingers pulled out a crisp white document, a formal withdrawal letter from the executive program. My name was already typed at the bottom. It just needed a signature. "We need to handle this like adults, Luke," Eleanor said. Her voice dripped with fake sugary concern. "You proved your point. Now it's time to be realistic." "Sign it. We'll cite health reasons," Richard ordered. He stood behind her, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Eleanor stepped closer, sliding a heavy paper clip over the top of the document. Tucked underneath it was a cashier's check. "The family will set you up with a quiet, comfortable IT manager job at the Ohio warehouse." Eleanor purred, tapping her long nail against the check. "Plus this, a fresh start. Don't try to climb a ladder that wasn't built for you. You'll just fall and break your neck exactly like your mother." They were trying to buy my future, my dignity, and my silence with a single piece of paper. They were perfectly willing to ship me off to a freezing warehouse in the Midwest just to clear the runway for Marcus to sit in the big chair. I looked down at the check. My breath hitched. My stomach violently churned. The numbers, printed in bold black ink, stared back at me. It was the exact dollar amount of the hospital bills Richard had refused to pay 15 years ago. The exact price tag he had placed on my mother's life while she coughed up blood in that rotting attic. My face turned to stone. The nausea faded, replaced by absolute freezing clarity. I looked up from the paper. I didn't look at Eleanor. I locked eyes with Richard. There was zero fatherly warmth in his stare, just cheap, dirty arithmetic. "You think my brain is this cheap?" I asked. No yelling, no shaking, just thick, suffocating disgust. I reached out and took the withdrawal letter and the check from Eleanor's hand. A smug, satisfied smirk spread across her face. Richard's shoulders finally dropped a fraction of an inch in relief. The dirty deal was done. My hands gripped the top edge of the thick paper. "Ripe!" Eleanor's smile snapped. I tore the documents perfectly down the middle. I stacked the two halves together. I tore them again. I let my hands fall open. The shredded confetti of the cashier's check and the withdrawal letter fluttered down, landing directly on the toes of Richard's expensive suede loafers. "Keep the cash," I said. I stepped forward, forcing Richard to shift his weight. As I walked past him, I dropped my shoulder and bumped hard against his collarbone. "Use it to buy a life insurance policy for your son's career." I didn't look back as I walked down the hall past Julian. "I'll see you in the spectator seats tomorrow morning, Richard. Don't be late." The Red Team audit room. The final test. 7 curved monitors surrounded my leather chair. Arthur Baxter stood directly behind me. I could hear his heavy, measured breathing. The breathing of a ruthless corporate shark who had fired thousands of people without blinking. Up in the glass observation gallery, I saw Marcus and Eleanor. They sat with their arms crossed, looking down at me like I was a circus animal performing a cheap trick. I was the only blue-collar engineer to ever make it to this final audit. If I failed today, they wouldn't blame my lack of sleep or the sheer difficulty of the test. They would blame my gender. They would blame my cheap clothes. They would blame my working-class mother. The simulated attack started. Red warning dots flooded the screens. The company's top internal hackers were throwing everything they had at my server framework. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I patched port 3. I locked down the external gateway. Everything was completely under control. Then a single line of code separated from the pack. It didn't look like modern syntax. It twisted and looped in a bizarre, archaic algorithm, burying itself into the core database. My brain froze. A massive wave of imposter syndrome crashed over me. I needed to be perfect. I couldn't make a single mistake in front of these rich snobs. That fear made my fingers hesitate. Just a fraction of a second. Too late. Beep. 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 A high-pitched, deafening alarm shrieked from the ceiling speakers. All 7 monitors flashed a bright, violent red. System failure. The defense grid collapsed. $50 million of simulated shareholder data vanished into thin air. Smack. Arthur slammed his heavy silver pen down on the glass desk. The sharp crack hit me like a physical blow to the spine. "You hesitated." Arthur's voice boomed through the room, cold and utterly disgusted. "Your hesitation just bankrupted an entire division, Ms. Baxter." I looked up at the glass gallery. Marcus was smirking. He leaned over and whispered something in Eleanor's ear. She laughed, covering her mouth with her hand. They were absolutely thrilled. The dirty blue-collar stray had finally proved them right. I was just a failure after all. 2 male executives had failed this exact test earlier today. Both of them had shouted, blaming the network speed and the equipment. I didn't make excuses. I stood up. I pressed my arms flat against my sides. I dug my fingernails deep into the palms of my hands until the skin nearly broke. My chest was burning with humiliation. "I accept the failure, sir," I said through gritted teeth. I walked out. 2 hours later, I was back in my freezing, cheap studio apartment. The room smelled like old carpet and cold Chinese takeout. Elena had texted me 3 times. I ignored her. Pity was useless right now. I know exactly how it feels to fall flat on your face in front of the exact people who want to see you destroyed. To give your toxic family the sick satisfaction of watching you fail. If you've ever had to swallow that bitter pill, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, what was the hardest failure you ever had to survive while your enemies were watching? How did you pull yourself out of the dirt? Let's talk about it. I grabbed the white cardboard takeout box and shoved it to the edge of my small table. I didn't cry. I didn't crawl into bed. I opened my personal laptop. I plugged in a heavy hard drive and ran the unauthorized download I had scraped from the corporate server before I walked out. the twisted, archaic virus that had just killed me. I stared at the red code reflecting in my dark room. I cracked my knuckles. Test run, I whispered to the empty room. Number 1. 4 days, 96 hours straight. I locked myself inside the freezing studio apartment. Empty cans of cheap energy drinks piled up next to the sink. My eyes were completely bloodshot, burning with dry heat. My temples throbbed, beating a heavy, painful rhythm against my skull. 11 times I ran the simulated attack. 11 times the virus ripped through my security patches and crashed the system, leaving my screen bleeding red. I slammed my palm flat against the sticky kitchen table. I dragged my hands down my face, feeling the exhaustion settling deep into my bones. I was pushing my physical body to the breaking point, starving, sleep-deprived, just like the woman who raised me. And then somewhere in the caffeine-fueled fever dream, I heard it. Dot. Dot. Dash. The pencil tapping against the rotting attic wood. Find the pattern. I grabbed the mouse and ripped open the core structure of the virus. It wasn't a direct brute force hack. It was an echo. The virus mirrored the system's own verification codes, tricking the firewalls into opening the front door. I flipped the code upside down. I typed out a completely new string of characters. A heavy, brutal counter hack designed to swallow the echo and fire it backward. I saved it to an encrypted flash drive. The morning of the retrial. The air inside the boardroom was suffocating. Chairman Arthur Baxter sat at the head of the glass table. Richard, Eleanor, and Marcus sat tightly grouped in the leather chairs to the left. They were practically vibrating with anticipation, waiting to watch the stray dog finally get put down. I sat alone at the center console. I slid the heavy plastic headphones over my ears. Initiate test, Arthur ordered. Across the building, the corporate red team hit their keyboards. They were arrogant. They dumped the exact same archaic virus into the pipeline, utterly convinced no one could patch that blind spot in 4 days. A bright red dot appeared on my main monitor. It shot forward, drilling straight toward my core database. Up in his leather chair, Marcus leaned forward. His lips parted. He was already sucking in air to laugh. But this time my fingers didn't hesitate. They flew across the keys, moving so fast they didn't leave a shadow. I didn't throw up a firewall. I didn't try to block the hit. The absolute second the virus touched my outer perimeter, my thumb smashed the enter key. I ripped open a massive back-end data tunnel. I pumped my newly written counter hack straight down the open pipe, feeding it directly into the red team's own incoming connection. It was the digital equivalent of pouring wet, heavy concrete straight down the exhaust pipe of a running engine. A violent, absolute, and completely silent execution. Faster than a human heartbeat. On the giant projection screen hanging above the boardroom table, the red team's monitoring feed violently glitched. Thick bars of static tore across their screens. Then total darkness. Their entire server network shut off. Dead. My counter-hack hadn't just stopped the attack. It had traveled backward and wiped their internal drives clean. Every single byte of data. Gone. A second later, my center monitor flashed. A blinding, solid, brilliant green. Perfect score. Total system integrity maintained. The boardroom was paralyzed. No one breathed. No one moved. Marcus was frozen, leaning forward, his mouth still hanging open in a silent, suffocated gasp. Richard's face lost all its color, turning a sickening pasty gray. I reached up and pulled the heavy headphones off my ears. Clack! The cheap plastic hit the glass desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the dead, silent room. I looked down at my hands. My knuckles were white, trembling slightly from the sheer physical crash of adrenaline and 4 days of starvation. I didn't rub them. I let them shake. I slowly looked up, locking eyes with Richard Baxter. My face was completely hollow, but the corner of my mouth twitched, curving upward into a dead, chilling smile. The annual shareholders' gala. Massive crystal chandeliers threw blinding yellow light across the grand ballroom. Hundreds of investors, executives, and politicians crowded the room, waiting for the final announcement. Chairman Arthur Baxter stepped up to the microphone. In his right hand, he held the heavy black brass master key, the physical symbol of the chief technology officer, the absolute top of the corporate ladder. Down in the front row, Marcus stood up straight. He smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo, rolling his shoulders back. He actually believed his pathetic lies about saving the Q4 launch would be enough to buy him the key. Richard stood right next to him, a massive, arrogant smile plastered across his face, hands already raised to start the applause. Arthur didn't even look at them. The old man walked right past Marcus. He stepped down from the stage and stopped directly in front of the back row. Right in front of me. The chairman turned to face the silent crowd. The harsh overhead lights caught the deep wrinkles around his eyes. He leaned into his microphone. 3 months ago, during the Q4 launch, this company was seconds away from a total financial wipeout. Arthur's voice cut through the room like a rusted saw blade. Our network crashed. The person who bypassed the dead firewalls wrote a 3-line kill switch, saved our entire global asset pool, and then deleted the logs to avoid taking the credit. Was Luke Baxter. The ballroom erupted in a collective gasp. Marcus's fake, heroic mask shattered into pieces. He stumbled backward, bumping hard into a catering table. His face drained of blood, turning as pale as a corpse. Richard's jaw dropped open. He looked like he was choking on air. Eleanor grabbed the back of a wooden chair, her knuckles turning white as she visibly shook. The brutal, naked truth had just ripped the parasitic skin right off their golden boy. Marcus, Arthur growled, not even turning his head to look at him. Your entire department would be bankrupt and rotting in federal court right now if it wasn't for your sister's brain. From this second forward, the CTO position and this key belong to the coldest, sharpest mind in this family. Arthur held out the heavy black brass key with both hands. I reached out and took the cold metal. I didn't smile. I didn't cry a single tear of joy. I didn't look at my biological father, my stepmother, or my brother. I just offered the old man a short, shallow nod. Thank you, Arthur, I said. I turned and walked out of the ballroom. I didn't need their apologies. They didn't exist in my reality anymore. 5 years later. I sat in a quiet, sunlit office in Manhattan, sitting across from David Cross, an investigative journalist for the Wall Street Journal. He clicked his pen, leaning forward over his notebook. How did it feel? David asked, studying my face. To finally crush the exact people who humiliated you for your entire life. I picked up a ceramic mug of black tea. The heat warmed my fingers. I took a slow sip. I didn't do it for revenge, David. I said, my voice completely flat. I don't need their applause. I never did. I just needed to prove to myself that my heartbeat belonged to a survivor, not a victim. I set the mug down. On the corner of my heavy oak desk sat a cheap wooden picture frame. Inside was a faded, frayed photograph of a poor, dying woman sitting in a leaking attic. Resting right next to that cheap photo was the heavy black brass master key of the Baxter Empire. The silence in the room was absolute. It had never felt so powerful. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It takes a lot of strength to walk away from the people who are supposed to love you, but sometimes the only way to save yourself is to leave them in the dark. I appreciate every single one of you who stayed with me until the end. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one.